Okay, welcome back. So this part of the lecture is it's a continuation of the last part, but maybe a little bit more advanced. So I'm doing this because in the syllabus it does say you have the option to choose to do these example homeworks from film stills. Film stills are a great area to look, or a medium to look at for storytelling with light, but it can be a little bit more challenging if you're still on the fence or having difficulty with drawing. So you really have a little bit of latitude here to decide, what your level of comfort is and whether you'd like to be doing still lives that you set up or from people that we've looked at, or if you are feeling like you would welcome a bit more of a challenge, you can try some film stills. The film still I chose, these are both from Minority Report, which is a Steven Spielberg, Tom Cruise movie. Steven Spielberg's really good at using value. So if you are thinking that you might like to do this, he's somebody I'd consider just because his films do such a good job of utilizing it to tell story. Tom Cruise can be a little bit of a handful, though. He's always running around, a little bit more of a difficult guy to paint, but we're just going to focus here on value. We're going to do all the same steps that we've been using, but just aimed at a slightly different example or medium. So I'm just doing my little value comp. Not something, again, you have to do. You could buy little value scales, so that might be something fun. Or when we look at the palette, I'll show you how I reconcile value there. But because we're talking about home values and all of that, I just want to get a basic idea to show you where I'm thinking, how I'm thinking. So the goal of this week's homework is to do and create thumbnails, right, which are, like we did with the still life, small, abstract kind of ideas or breakdowns of what the whole value configuration of a picture is. So in our steps, do the frame first. The reason for thumbnail, the name, is because these should always be done smaller. Right? You don't. I would say at the very most, these should be like a index card in terms of their sizing. Anything larger than that is too much. So I want to just also give you some insights into why I propose that we draw that way, so that you can get a sense of how it might be useful when breaking down other compositions. So like in our setup here, I started with my frame, I did my divisions. After that, we could do some kind of plumb lines and finding shapes. What I see that's interesting to this image is that it's kind of right on top of that vertical. And then there's, in this scene, he's kind of running along these cars. So these are futuristic cars that are moving up and down this wall. So that's a vertical wall. So there's a shape here. There's a little shape over here. So this is a car. There's a shape down here. And then there's a shape over here. Almost like music notes. So this composition has a nice feeling of rhythm, right? Because our eye kind of travels through those. And then we also have, in contrast to that, we have these kind of like, I guess these would be the tracks that the cars move along. So there's these guys here. So let's go put some of those in quickly. And like tracks or rails, I would imagine. If you haven't seen this movie, he's a policeman that is able to, and with the help of these psychics, kind of like see future crimes before they take place. So basically the whole movie, he's like running to solve crimes before they take place. Now, if we look at the value, one thing we could add in terms of talking about the value scale, which I know is like maybe not the most exciting thing that you've ever worked with, but in Hollywood or in film, they only use 5 different types of value comps. And you can see a lot of this in painting too, or we could say 5 value types or schemes. And they all have to do with different sections of the value scale, right? So think of the value scale like you would music. Like your favorite song probably isn't every note in a scale starting from the bottom up to the top and then back down again. But yet in art, we treat value in rendering as if it were, right? As just because we can fit all the values in means that our piece or our drawing or our painting will have more value, will have more worth. People enjoy it more. And I think instead what's true is that people appreciate artistry because of what you leave out. And that's definitely the case here, right? So in Hollywood, there's 5 basic types. There's that you see most people use. There's a high key, which is in reference to just that aspect, the lightest side. Usually this has to do with flashbacks or scenes that project optimism. There's mid-range. That would be the just bracketing to use only these values, the middle of the value scale. This always produces a feeling of calm, and maybe that's because it's associated with dusk or dawn. These are times of day that are soothing because there's not an intensity to light. There's richer colors. There's a maybe more peaceful mood. There's also low key, not like the marble character, low key with light. And so that is kind of taking this end, right, all this dark end, and then punching in a light. This always creates effect of mystery. So the bottom left example is an example of this. 4 is high contrast. This is when we pair the light end against the dark end in without any middle. This always has to do with producing a lot of anxiety or drama. That's a kind of effect that we get from images like this as an audience. And then 5th would be high key. So just using the very light end of the value scale with accent, so with a dark accent. So it's really the reverse of 3. And number 5 is always used in film for directing vision and negotiating vision to a specific area. So if we look at any of these, right, and kind of the associated psychological effects, this is why we make thumbnail studies, because the storytelling with light is really here. The rest is just objects, right? But the artistry of presenting the image to the viewer has a lot to do with where we position our value. So that's part of the reason that I'm asking you to think about simplifying down so that you can try to keep that quality of story in mind prior to rendering. So now let's go into our next step. So once we did our kind of surfacing, all the drawing components, let's say we finished that, the next thing is I'm going to look at direction and angle. So in this example, the direction is this kind of flat wall, right? So there's this surface and all the cast shadows kind of go with this. Let's do this on a different layer, just so if we want, we could take it off later. And I'll use a different color for this. And then the angle of light is diagonal. Right, so you can see that. So the light's coming from up here. This is blue. Light's coming from this way and basically hitting against that flat surface of the wall. So what do we get from that? Well, up here I basically get the shape of each car kind of distorted for the wall. And so I'll just go through and now I'm doing the same thing we did in our still life. I'm breaking up the object to look at the light side shape versus the shadow side shape, and then the resulting cast shadow. And in some cases we can just weld them together. Like I'm going to weld together this car with the cast shadow shape of the bottom car. And then this car's cast shadow comes over this car. Right? So there's a lot of welding or blending of shapes at this stage. And I think what we get with just the direction of light, the direction and angle, so ideas that we're just focusing on this week, is a really important story. Right? So if we put, Tom Cruise right in the middle, let's isolate him to that prior layer, and I'm just going to say he's like a dark blob, because he is here. He's just a little blob guy. If I take away the lighting and the direction, in terms of the composition, he just looks like he's floating. As soon as we add it, now there's this kind of pronounced feeling of movement, right? Of energy. So horizontals and verticals always give us static or passive qualities of feeling. Diagonals always produce drama. Right, so now it feels more to me like he's jumping. Right? We could even draw in his cast shadow just as a shape here. Right, so there's a a very different quality in the movement just by way of how the light's used. If we now just go to story, I would say that this comes closest to me having this. There's a lot of real abrupt shifts of light against dark. All right, so if I look at cast shadow, let's say the wall is really light. It's somewhere maybe around a 2 or a 3. It varies because of those stripes. Right, there's a very intense light here. And so now what we're talking about is the way to use home values. Remember, I'm always trying to look at an object, imagine what its home value is, and then based on the intensity of light, I'm just going to do plus or minus. So if I know that it's here, my light side will get much brighter, maybe into a 1. My dark side might fall into a 4 or 5. So I'm going to say that all of the shadows here are 4s. So I'm going to put these in just as big blobs. So we have this. I'm going to blend the shape all the way in. Maybe I can get a little bit darker. Again, with the thumbnail, you're not going to be really concerned right now with all of the properties of keeping the drawing. Drawing just gets you to a point where you could start to negotiate and think about some of these shapes. And we can always come back later and fill in those missed areas or off areas in the drawing. That's more a rendering consideration. That background is a 3, and so I'm going to put this in as a lighter shape. Just painting in the whole shape, trying to use the biggest brush possible. So there's Tom Cruise. Here's his background. Sometimes with drawing or with painting, my drawing can be also a consideration of pushing one shape back. Right, so I'm drawing into the shape by moving it, in other words, or adjusting the shape. The proportion of a shape, the design of the shape is also one way to think about the drawing. And that could be a thumbnail. Right? I could also, we could spend more time talking about each individual car. This one's very light. This car is very dark, so its home value is more of a 4. Right? So in this area, it's going to be, or maybe like a 5, which would move it to a 6 in shadow. So I could have that there. Maybe this one gets a little bit darker. But I wouldn't go into any of the little details on the cars. Maybe the shadow side on this car is a little bit darker there. So for me, this could be number 4. It might be a little bit light on contrast, so it could also be number 5. If you think about the majority of the thumbnail, it's primarily high key. The majority of the image is lighter values, and then our attention really is focused in on the darkest, which is Tom Cruise. So that's the high key with accent. So we get focused here, and then we're told a story about the dynamic movement, in part helped by the shapes of the cast shadows. So that's a thumbnail. That would be done. Something like this would be perfectly acceptable for homework. It's a way for you to get comfortable with the paint, using the paint, and thinking about some of these theoretical ideas that we're introducing in terms of drawing and basic ideas of light versus shadow. What you should double check by the time you're done, though, is does your object have a light side? Does it have a shadow side? And is there a cast shadow? Let's try one more, and then that'll be it for discussion, and we'll just go into painting. So here's one more frame. I'm going to do my same thing, just a really loose drawing. This image has a lot more diagonals. The first thing I notice, I'm trying to kind of get the ground here. And I can't really do envelopes, right? So envelopes are a better strategy for still lives and things like that. And that's why I said I would maybe keep these examples to those of you that feel more confident or like you want to challenge or have more experience in terms of drawing. So what I'm going to do here is kind of lay in that ground plane and set up the doorway. So the light angle in the first picture was really high. I think the light angle in this picture is lower. It's kind of coming from directly behind this character. And I'm going to put in like a basic, let's just put in like a basic figure shape here. Just do a block person, stick figure. And then because of that strong light, we get a shape like this, the door. And then we get a long cast shadow shape. There's this guy's shadow kind of projecting out. And then there's a hooded figure over here that I can't really make out. Right, and then this is all kind of lighting. This is the break in terms of the shadow. And here's the wall. Okay, so that'd be enough drawing here, maybe even too much. So what I'm going to do next is, in terms of the lighting, think about the basic use of value. So in terms of the storytelling, I'd say this is definitely number 3. There's a great deal of mystery in this image. Like this is the penultimate scene of confrontation in the movie. And it's primarily just dark, right? So it's mostly a value 8 or 9. So in terms of my thumbnail, I would just go right for that and drawing in or painting in the big shapes. Right, so it goes up here. Even though there's in these areas a lot of little smaller lights that kind of fill in some of this darkness, I'm going to just paint it all as one thing for now. You can always come back in later and add those. So for the idea of doing the thumbnails, I just want to get that overall big idea first. There's not a lot in terms of home value for me to kind of break down and look at here. There's not as much in terms of specific objects. I think this scene is much more just about mood. And so there's not a lot of, in other words, clarity around what each individual object is doing in terms of form. And that's usually a conscious choice, right? The way that you create anxiety or mystery in terms of an image is to take away information. So like think of every horror movie you've seen. It's scary because of what you can't see, right? And then the monster at some point is exposed, and then you get grossed out and you have your jump or your shock. The tension that's built up prior to the reveal is really the not seeing, the not knowing. Something runs by, there's a shadow that kind of moves. So this one might be all value 9 or 10, and then a long shape like this, right, which is kind of in terms of storytelling, very graphic and sharp and pointed. And our eyes always respond to really sharp shapes as something that's dangerous. Right? Round shapes, right, like these above, are usually passive. Think of like animation. Right? All the characters are always round, Mickey Mouse. Those are relatable, kind of passive, friendly ideas of shape. Anything that's sharp or extended is often thought of as threatening or predatory. This character, maybe we do our 3 value breakdown. We have a dark, value 10 for the background, a light, which is the shaft of light coming through, and then I would say we have a value 5 that is behind him here in the doorway. And so this is a little bit darker, just kind of back here. And so one thing that you can look at, right, if you're breaking down values, just like I have here for only the home value pattern, so this is mostly just home values, and I'm not going to add any more detail than this, is that most images at their very basic, right, design are usually no more than 3. There's usually a dark, a light, and a middle. So I want you to really think about that when you're creating your thumbnails this week. Right? Same thing here. Dark, light, middle value. And even more, most of the time, those are organized for our eye in asymmetrical percentages. So a light, a middle, and a dark. And very often these are organized for design in 60, 30, 10 percentages. So like in this one, there's 60% light, 30% mid, and I'm thinking percent, what I'm talking about is the overall proportion that takes up in the picture. So 60% light, 30% mid, and then we have about 10% dark. And what does that do? It kind of aims our attention in at the main figure. Your eye always tracks the minority in an image. So your eye always kind of looks for the minority. This one would be 60% dark, 30% light, and then 10% mid. So these are continuation or review of the ideas that were introduced in the Chardin example. A little bit more complicated here because I've added the 5 value types that you see in film, given you in these examples a little bit more complexity in terms of what's available to be drawn and how. So this could just be maybe an interesting side lecture, or it could be something that you want to try and challenge yourself to do, maybe just one of for homework. But film does allow us a lot of these extra considerations for storytelling and value that might not first be apparent in still lifes, even though they are there. And so I wanted to make sure that you could see it as having relevance to the moment, our contemporary moment, in addition to some of the historical imagery that we look at. And now on to some actual painting.